It's a great pleasure to be here in the Tri-City area and to have an opportunity to meet so many of you and to share some thoughts with you. It's always encouraging to see so many young families that are becoming interested in homeschooling, are homeschooling, and are introducing others to this new phenomenon in the United States. As a matter of fact, homeschooling is the fastest growing educational phenomenon in the United States. And there's good reason for it. And I will spend some time this evening giving you the reasons why so many parents are turning to homeschooling. In a sense, parents should homeschool even if there were nothing wrong with the schools. But since there's so much that is wrong with the schools, I think it's good for us to go over that, so then we even have greater incentive to keep doing what we're doing. I'm sure all of you are aware that we have this tremendous problem of illiteracy in the United States. It seems sort of an anomaly that in the great United States, with all of our money and technology and schools, that we should be dealing with an illiteracy problem. Doesn't seem to make sense, does it? For example, on the plane, I was reading the latest issue of Business Week magazine. They had a 2-page spread sponsored by General Dynamics Corporation on the subject of illiteracy. It said, 1 out of 5 adult Americans is unable to read this sentence, or a warning label, or a job application, or a love letter. You see, more than 27 million adult Americans are functionally illiterate, and their ranks are swelling by more than 2 million every year. How do you like that? Their ranks are swelling. Where are all these functional illiterates coming from? Coming out of the schools, believe it or not. As a high-technology maker of America's defense systems, we find this trend more menacing than Soviet missiles. This trend is more menacing than Soviet missiles. In the year when all Americans celebrate the 200th birthday of the Constitution, millions of us can't even read it. Isn't that amazing? You'd wonder, how is it possible for the United States to have an illiteracy problem? USA Today, not too long ago, had a full-page ad about it. Make a fist. We are challenging adult illiteracy in America. Join the fight. Well, you see, now we're going to fight illiteracy with a fist. We're in a real battle. So they want to make Americans aware that we have an illiteracy problem. Here's another ad that was in a Business Week or one of the major magazines, showing a man with a little girl on his knee, reading a story to her. To 27 million Americans, this scene is a fairy tale. That's because 27 million Americans can't read a child's bedtime story, can't read a street sign, can't read, period. Functional illiteracy has become an epidemic that has reached 1 out of 5 American adults. So you see now that it's being compared to a disease, an epidemic, so you'd better not sit next to a functional illiterate. You're liable to catch it. There's another ad that was in national magazines about the ABC PBS program on this illiteracy business. Of course, they've had these documentaries on public television. They're all over the place now. They actually had a TV show the other night about a man who was faking it. I think the show was called Bluffing It, and was all about an American adult who was bluffing his way through as a functional illiterate. And this particular ad says, federal studies estimate that as many as 23 million adult Americans are functionally illiterate. Another 35 million are classified as semi-literate, and the numbers are growing. Boy, they sure want us to know that we have an illiteracy problem in America. Time magazine then had an article entitled, "Losing the War of Letters." Now we're involved in a war. You know, we keep getting involved in these strange wars. You remember the war on poverty? Who won that war? Then President Nixon declared war on illiteracy back in the Nixon administration with the Right to Read program. He launched a program that was going to wipe out illiteracy in 10 years. It was called the Right to Read program. Few people remember it. Well, the 10 years have come and gone, and boy, that was a war we lost, isn't it? It's much worse today than it was during the Nixon years. So whoever is supposed to be fighting this war isn't doing much of a job. I think the NEA is involved in the fight somewhere in this whole business. Then there was an article in a recent issue of U.S. News and World Report about the burgeoning educational underclass. Nationwide, nearly 1 million students graduate each year unable to read and write. Graduate unable to read and write. What about the dropouts? Of course, we just assume they can't read and write. But these are the graduates. And the problem has been getting worse. And of course, this particular article on the underclass was dealing with the minorities who were the chief victims of this whole illiteracy business, blacks and Hispanics. Here's a full-page ad sponsored by the NEA. I believe they have something to do with education. About dropouts. Dropouts, the quiet killer of the American dream, once a dilemma, now a crisis. 30% of American teenagers aren't graduating from high school. That's 750,000 dropouts each year. And of course, the situation is getting worse. Here's one on the brain battle, the battle between the Japanese and the United States on the brain battle. Feature major article in U.S. News. And this particular article states, students in the U.S. now enter the job market with inferior skills. Once the unquestioned champion in industrial research, America is watching its lead dwindle. Some experts go so far as to suggest that failings in education put the nation in danger of becoming a second-class economic power. So there's General Dynamics telling us that this is a worse threat than Soviet missiles. Now we're being threatened with becoming a second-rate power. Here's an interesting article that was in the Washington Post about what private industry is doing to teach young adults reading and writing. Education by industry is booming. Firms spend $40 billion annually to teach young adults skills that they should have been taught in your very expensive public schools, for which we all pay taxes. Now, you might ask yourself, how can this possibly be so? You know, there are an awful lot of people who come to this country who want to come to America because they know that it's the land of opportunity, it's the most advanced nation on earth. And you can imagine a foreigner coming to these shores, thankful to be here, anxious to participate in the great American experiment, anxious to partake of the American dream. And he opens these magazines and he reads all these stories about illiteracy in America, and he's absolutely shocked. He says, how can this possibly be so? And so he thinks to himself, gee, I've got to help these Americans do something about this illiteracy problem. And so you might meet him at a social gathering, and he may come up to you and say, gee, I've been reading all about this horrible illiteracy problem you have. I have a wonderful solution to your problem. Why don't you create a system of free public schools? That would wipe out your illiteracy problem overnight. And you'd look back at him and say, but we do have a system of free public schools in America. Everybody can go to school in America free of charge. You don't have to pay a dime. There's a free public school in every city, town, hamlet, and if you don't live near a free public school, they will put you on a bus and make sure you get to one. So that's not our problem. You have free public schools and you've got an illiteracy problem? Oh, I know what your problem must be. What you need is compulsory school attendance. That's what you need. You see, if you've got all these free public schools and the kids aren't attending them, that's why you have all of this illiteracy. Isn't that so? And you look back at him and say, compulsory attendance? Why, we've had compulsory school attendance in every state for years and years. Everyone in America must go to school. If you don't go to school, they'll put you in a home for delinquent children. If your parents don't send you to school, they'll fine them, send them to jail. Oh, you must go to school in America. That's not our problem. We have compulsory school attendance. So we'd look back at you and say, you've got free public schools and compulsory school attendance, and you have an illiteracy problem? How can that possibly be? And then he'd think and say, oh, I know what your problem must be. Your teachers aren't trained, are they? That's your problem. Teachers not trained? Why, every teacher in our schools must attend a teacher's college. Every teacher must get a Bachelor of Arts degree, even a master's degree. As a matter of fact, you cannot teach in a public school without being certified. That's better than the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. They don't let anyone teach. Oh, our teachers are well trained by the government. Well, he would really be surprised. You've got free public schools, compulsory school attendance, and certified teachers, and you have an illiteracy problem. And he'd think further, what could possibly be the cause? Oh, I know what the cause is. You don't have adequate supervision. That's the problem. You've got this system, but it seems to be going off on its own without any proper supervision. Supervision, you'd reply. Why, we've got professors of education, administrators, supervisors, superintendents, principals. Why, no system in America has more supervision than public education. You can't do anything in a public school without scrutiny of the supervisors. You can't even say a prayer without their knowing it. Oh, we've got plenty of supervision. Nothing goes on in an American classroom without the knowledge of the hierarchy on top. And we pay these supervisors a lot of money to make sure that the system is well supervised. Well, now he's really in a quandary. You've got free public schools, you've got compulsory school attendance, you've got trained teachers, you've got plenty of supervision. What could possibly be the problem? Oh, I know what the problem is. He'd say, you're not doing enough research. What you need is more educational research. Research, you'd reply. Why, we've got thousands of scholars on all sorts of government grants, foundation grants, State Department grants, doing all sorts of educational research. We have journals of education crammed with research. We've got data banks crammed with educational research. As a matter of fact, the teaching of reading is one of the most researched subjects in American education. And all of this costs the taxpayer millions and millions of dollars every year. We even have conventions of researchers who do nothing but read each other's research. Well, this man, he's totally puzzled. You've got free public schools, you've got compulsory school attendance, you've got certified teachers, plenty of supervision, plenty of research. What could be the problem? Oh, I know what your problem is. You're not spending enough money. Isn't that it? Money's the problem. Money, you'd reply. Well, the United States spends more money on education than any nation in the history of the universe. As a matter of fact, we believe so strongly in education that everyone has permitted a lien to be put on their property to make sure that the schools are supported. You see how much we believe in public education? We've put up our property as security to make sure that the schools are properly supported. And our teachers now get an average of $25,000 a year. And of course, our principals and supervisors are doing well, and we intend to raise teacher salaries. We're very aware that they need more money. Well, this man would be beside himself. He'd say, well, if you've got all of that, how can you possibly have an illiteracy problem? Well, then you'd look at him with a rather glum face and you'd say, well, I'll explain to you what our problem is. You see, every year, hundreds of thousands of American women give birth to defective children. That's the reason why we have a reading problem. They give birth to all of these children with these learning disabilities, with this strange new disease called dyslexia. That's why we have this problem. So he'd look at you and say, so it's not an educational problem, it's a medical problem. You say, yes, I'm afraid so. That's our problem. We've got all of these defective children. That's why we have massive illiteracy in the United States. Now, what I've just told you is the current wisdom. That's the wisdom of the establishment, that the reason why we have the literacy problems is because of all of these defective youngsters with these learning disabilities. And to give you an idea of how this wisdom has filtered down to the popular media, some time ago, when I was traveling on a Delta airliner, I picked up a copy of the magazine they put in the pockets of the seats. It's called Sky Magazine. And that particular issue had a lead article on the reading problem entitled, Dealing with Dyslexia. Well, I've been dealing with this subject for about 20 years, so I was quite interested to find out what this author had to say. Maybe he had some information that I had never seen, so I was quite anxious to read the article. And of course, this article was printed in a very glossy, beautiful magazine that's read by intelligent businessmen. Many of them who travel on the airlines every day, and so I read it with great interest. Now he tells us that first he tells us what dyslexia is. He says it's one of the most misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and underestimated of the learning language disorders. So as you can see, we're already dealing with a rather mysterious kind of condition. And then he describes the dyslexia as a disorder manifested by difficulty in learning to read despite conventional instruction, adequate intelligence, and sociocultural opportunity. Well, what that means is that you can be rich and smart and still be dyslexic. And probably the most famous example of such an individual was the late Nelson Rockefeller, who was very rich, I guess somewhat smart, and quite dyslexic. The interesting thing about Nelson Rockefeller is that he would joke about his not being able to read, and he would tell us why he couldn't read. He'd say, I attended a progressive school, and they didn't teach me to read. That's why I can't read. And he'd joke about it, and then he'd talk off the cuff, as he usually did. That was his method. And it's true. Nelson and three of his other brothers all attended the Lincoln experimental school that teaches College Columbia University. As a matter of fact, his father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., donated $3 million to the Lincoln School, to this experimental school. And I suppose he wanted something for his money, so he put 4 of his sons in the school, 3 of whom emerged as functional illiterates. Nelson used to joke about his not being able to read. His brother Lawrence bemoans the fact that he has a terrible reading problem. And of course, Winthrop did so poorly that he dropped out of college. Now, of course, that did not stop him from becoming the governor of Arkansas, which only proves that even a functional illiterate can become governor. And of course, we almost had a functionally illiterate president, since Nelson Rockefeller was a heartbeat away from the presidency during Gerald Ford's time. So one of these days, we may very well have a functional illiterate in the White House. Somebody will have to do all the reading for him. In any case, this article goes on and has some rather startling information. It appears that this author came across a rather interesting woman by the name of Elizabeth Fleming. She's interesting because she has had 5 dyslexic children. As a matter of fact, she says that her family is the perfect dyslexia lab. And she's written a book on the subject. I mean, if you had 5 dyslexic kids, you'd write a book too. And this is what Mrs. Fleming has to say about dyslexia. She says, I feel that dyslexia is a progressive hereditary trait, one that is increasing in the human population. More and more dyslexics are diagnosed every year. In the United States, an estimated 10% of the children entering kindergarten are being diagnosed dyslexic. In these days of growing anxiety that modern man may not be able to keep up with the information explosion and technological advances made during this century, I suggest that man need not fear. Perhaps hereditary dyslexics are the new breed of man, an evolutionary species that does not live in a world of up, down, right, left, but rather in the multidimensional or non-dimensional world of space. Can this be called the age of dyslexia, asks Mrs. Fleming. Well, if we're in the age of dyslexia, I don't know how we're going to handle the age of information. But according to John Naisbitt, in his book Megatrends, he tells us that we're now in the age of information, but according to Mrs. Fleming, we are now in the age of dyslexia. And now we're dealing with a new breed of man, a new hereditary species, an evolutionary species, a genetic mutation, if you will. That's rather interesting because I remember that when I went to school and was taught about evolution, they said that in evolution, things are supposed to get better and better. People are supposed to get smarter and smarter. How come in this case they're getting dumber and dumber? And how come this evolutionary trend has only hit the United States? It's completely avoided the Soviet Union, which is 3 times as big. And of course, it's avoided Iceland, which has 99.9999% literacy. I didn't realize that evolution could be so discriminating. You know, it's interesting how evolution picks certain countries. Well, the problem with Mrs. Fleming is that she's a victim of her own ignorance. It's as simple as that. This is all nonsense. Complete, utter nonsense. You see, we know why we have a reading problem. It's no mystery. We've known it for over 30 years. We've known it ever since 1955, when Dr. Rudolph Flesch published his famous book, Why Johnny Can't Read. Remember that book? Did you realize that that was published in 1955? What does that make it? 35, how many years? 35, 37 years ago? He wrote 32 years ago, I guess. Yeah. 55, yeah. 37. And this is what he told us. In 1955, he said, look, there's nothing wrong with your children. They haven't suddenly become afflicted with all of these horrible learning disabilities, these horrible new diseases. He said the reason why they're not learning to read is because they're not being taught to read correctly. And these are the words he used. He said the teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. And then he explained how in the early 1930s the professors of education changed the way reading is taught in American schools. They threw out the alphabetic phonics method, which is the proper way you teach children to read an alphabetic writing system, and they put in a new method, a look-say, whole word or sight word method that teaches children to read English as if it were Chinese, an ideographic writing system. And he said when you impose an ideographic instruction technique on an alphabetic writing system, you create reading problems. It's as simple as that. Now, perhaps you're not too familiar with the difference between an alphabetic writing system and an ideographic one. I will explain that to you, but before I do so, let me explain the difference between a simple illiterate and a functional illiterate. A simple illiterate is someone who never went to school and never learned to read. But we don't have too many of those anymore. Everybody goes to school. A functional illiterate is someone who has spent for anywhere from 8 to 12 years in school and has emerged at the end of the process with such deficient reading skills, such abysmally poor skills, that for all practical purposes he or she might as well be considered illiterate. You see, you have to go to school to become a functional illiterate. And American schools now specialize in producing functional illiteracy. And it's not easy. It's not easy at all. You need special reading programs, special textbooks, specially trained teachers. It's not easy keeping someone in school for 12 years and making sure that he or she doesn't learn to read. What do you do with them all during that period of time? You know what you do? You pretend that you're teaching. You see, that's what you do. And that's what American schools have become very good at, pretending to teach. The American public school is the great pretense now. They pretend to teach, and yet they have the gall to admit that they are graduating 1 million functional illiterates a year. And they say that with a straight face. They believe that the American people are now so dumb, so deceived, that they can say anything and get away with it. That's exactly what they're doing, you see. Now, what is the difference between an alphabetic writing system and an ideographic one? Well, ours is an alphabetic